Hi Year 11s. This is our second PowerPoint in the ecosystems topic of biology for stage 1. And this week we're going to look at biodiversity. Last week we looked at classification and adaptations. Part of this will include going through some ecosystems key words, which we did look at last year in Year 10. But let's begin talking about biodiversity. As per usual in class, there will be a need to know. Bear in mind we're going to try and take the notes from the video this week rather than doing the notes in class, but we'll still go through the notes in class as revision and to consolidate our ideas, but most of the notes will be taken actually from the video this week. So, starting. Looking at populations interacting with the community. So, first off, there's two terms straight away that we need to discuss there, populations and community. So first one, community. Community is made up of a localized interacting populations. So community is made up of different populations all interacting together. And each population has its own specific role to play in that community. If you're a member of a community, you tend to stay in that area and you don't move into other communities. So that's great that the community is a group of populations, but what is a population? Population generally is a group of species, all of the same species that live together. So for example, you can see we've got one individual here, which is this moose over here. A population is a group of those moose all living together. And then community, we have the moose living with what appears to be some sort of feline predator. We've got some birds. Community is different populations all coming together, living together and working together. Okay, so population, group of organisms, all the same species living together. Community, group of different populations, all interacting. Moving a little bit further, as we're talking about the word species and how to define the word species. So we said a population is a group of organisms of the same species, but what is a species? Generally, a species is a group of organisms that are more or less alike, and when they reproduce, they'll produce fertile offspring together. Obviously, that's not the best definition for a species. That's the best that science currently has to offer, but it's not the best because it doesn't apply to all organisms. So, for example, animals that reproduce asexually, well, they're not going to reproduce and produce fertile offspring with other members of the species because they're reproducing asexually, so it doesn't work for them. Another definition that we have is that they could share a common gene pool. Generally, when we're talking about members of the same species, they have very similar features. There will be common features toward each other, easily recognizable. But like I said, we've got two definitions. Neither are fantastic, but they're the best that science currently has to offer for what is a species. And if you're ever asked in the test what is a species, you'd just say an organism that can breed together and produce fertile offspring. That would be the best answer in a test. So, species, it's great that we know what community is, we know what population is, we know what species is. What we need to know is how, when we're talking about that community, how those different species are all going to interact with each other, because every species has what's called an ecological niche, and that's the role that an organism plays in the ecosystem based on the interactions with the community. So there's lots of different interactions that we have. Four that we're going to talk about here are competition, predation, parasitism, and mutualism. Competition is when two or more organisms will compete for the same resource. There's limited resources, so organisms have to compete for those resources to ensure they're going to get them and they're going to survive. Predation is when one species pursues, captures, kills, and eats another species. Parasitism is when one species lives inside another. The organism that lives inside the other organism is called the parasite, and the organism that's having the parasite live inside it is called the host. This interaction, parasitism, it's of benefit to the parasite, but it's of detriment to the host. Mutualism is the last one we're going to talk about, is when two organisms will benefit from an interaction with each other. So they're living and helping each other, but they both benefit from that interaction. Okay, another term we need to discuss is ecosystem. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a location that's made up of communities of living things, which we call biotic factors, and the interactions of those living things with the non-living components of the location, which are the abiotic factors. And we're going to talk about abiotic and biotic factors in depth in this video. So, first off, biotic factors. These are the living factors of that affect ecosystems or a community. Ones we've already talked about: competition, predation, mutualism. These are types of biotic factors. They're the interactions between those organisms. We talked about them a few slides back. One that we didn't talk about is communalism. That's when there's one organism helping another. It's of no detriment to that organism, but it's of benefit to the organism that's being helped. So that's another interaction that happens in ecosystems, communalism. Animals themselves can be biotic factors because one animal can change the physical or chemical environment, which will prevent others from living there. It might help other animals be able to live there. So for example, earthworms. Earthworms will help aerate the soil and recycle nutrients. So having earthworms is a biotic factor because it's providing basically oxygen or air in the soil, provides nutrients to be recycled, allows other plants to live there. Grazing is another example. So things like buffalo grazing basically destroys vegetation, prevents that vegetation from growing. So that's another biotic factor that we could talk about. So biotic factors, just anything living that affects the ecosystem. Abiotic factors, on the other hand, are the non-living factors. So we're talking about things like temperature, high or low temperature, the amount of sunlight, the amount of rainfall. When talking about things like soil, we could be talking about things like pH, what types of minerals are in the soil, how much water is in the soil, how does the soil move, is there been fires or frost, is there toxic substances in the area, is the salt, how much salt is in the water, how strong is the water moving down a stream of water, how deep, how turbid is the water. So for example, if we're talking about Australia, we have a lot of fires, and that's an abiotic factor. So many of our Australian plants have actually become fire resistant, and they can quickly regrow their leaves after a fire is there. There are some plants that will even spur the fires to help kill off other plants, like eucalyptus trees. When their leaves, they release eucalyptus oil, which helps burn the fire. So everything, because they're resistant to fire, they survive, but everything else around them burns, and then all the nutrients in the soil are left for the eucalyptus trees. And there are some plants here that actually require fire to germinate those seeds, and without fire, those plants won't actually ever survive or grow. Okay, moving on to biodiversity. So biodiversity is the next part. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity is short for the term biological diversity, and basically what that's saying is how much life or how much different variation is there of life on Earth. And to discuss biodiversity in an ecological point, we have to talk about three different levels of biodiversity: species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and genetic diversity. Starting with species diversity. Species diversity is the number of different species in an area, taking into account the richness and evenness of species. And don't worry, we'll define those two words there, richness and evenness. Richness is a measure of how many different species are in an area. Evenness looks at how many of each species is in that area. So basically, when we're talking about species diversity, how many different species are there, and how many of each species are there. Because if you've got 15 different species, you could say you've got species diversity, but if there's only one member of each species, then it's not a really diverse ecosystem in terms of species, because with only one organism there, they can't reproduce, and they won't be able to, they may not survive any disasters that come their way. Why is species diversity important? One, because species diversity is the result of millions of years of evolution. It results in a balanced ecosystem. If the more species that are there and the more number of each species that are there, ensures that there's more survivability of each organism in that ecosystem. Because when you lose just one species in an ecosystem, it has a flow-on effect. There might be a food source for another animal, or it might be the numbers of that organism might have been contained by another organism. Removing one species, if there's not high species diversity, has the potential to cause an ecosystem to go out of balance, essentially. Bees and birds are a great example of this, because bees and birds pollinate over 90% of all plants on Earth. So remove bees and birds, plants don't pollinate, plants will die out. Plants die out, we lose producers, whole food chains collapse. So bees and birds are really important for species diversity as well. And this is what can happen if you remove one organism or one set of species from an ecosystem. Moving on to genetic diversity. This refers to the variation in the number and types of genes that are expressed in those, or in the species themselves. Each individual in a species may have a slightly different form of genes because of mutations over time. Those variations will change the genotype and the phenotype of those individuals in the population. Remember, genotype is the actual genes in the organism, phenotype is the physical appearance. We need genetic variation because it helps produce fertile offspring, healthy and fertile offspring that can breed and resist disease. It also helps us change over time in response to changing environments. There is a video that we'll watch at this point. We'll watch that in class. We won't be watching that in this video though. Why is genetic diversity important? We kind of covered this a little bit already. Basically, having high genetic diversity makes an ecosystem more resilient to environmental change. Low genetic diversity will cause inbreeding, which will increase the number of genetic flaws or disabilities in an ecosystem. Those with low genetic diversity, like ecosystems with low genetic diversity, are more likely to go extinct. And once lost genetic diversity is really hard to regain, and it generally means the end of a population or the end of an ecosystem. Ecosystems diversity. So this is the last one we're going to talk about here. Ecosystem diversity basically describes the biological communities and the ecosystems that they live. So, for example, a species will not be able to survive in an ecosystem if its requirements aren't limited. So we need a range of different ecosystems themselves so that all our different species can survive in them. So, for example, we might have Arctic ecosystems, or we might have tropical ecosystems, or desert ecosystems. There needs to be a large range of ecosystems for different species. The higher the biodiversity level in an ecosystem, the more stable that ecosystem is. We will watch a video here on why biodiversity is important, but just some benefits here as well. Humans benefit financially by extracting the goods that can be processed and sold from ecosystems, such as timber, food, medicines. All those things come from having diverse ecosystems. Having an increased biodiversity leads to having cleaner air, better balance of atmospheric gases, water cycle, climate regulation, climate change is reduced. We get nature playgrounds where people can escape city life and actually go and enjoy nature. Biodiversity helps maintain genetic diversity, decreasing the number of flaws, etc. in an ecosystem. It allows us to research. Having them there allows us to go back and research them for ecosystems we may not know much about. And lastly, the big one here is that humans are part of the web of life, and if we damage that web, we may suffer consequences, because having that web of life is what sustained us getting timber, food, medicine. Removing all that, and if we don't protect the biodiversity, we remove those sources for timber, food, medicines, which affects our existence in itself. That's the end of the PowerPoint this week. See you in class.